The alarm went off at 5:15, the same as it did every morning. And Daniel Carter silenced it before the second buzz, a habit he'd developed not from discipline but from necessity. Lily's room was just across the hall, and she'd been sleeping lighter since the spring. He didn't know why. She never complained about it. She never complained about much of anything, which was the thing about his daughter that filled him with the most love and the most guilt in equal, indistinguishable measure. He sat on the edge of the mattress for a moment, letting his eyes adjust. The room was still dark. The window showed a strip of pre-dawn gray. That particular color that existed between night and morning, not quite either one. He rubbed the back of his neck, stood, and padded down the hall toward the kitchen in his socks. The kitchen table had been cleared the night before and set up as a staging area. There were 3 bags of balloons, 2 pink, 1 silver, a roll of plastic tablecloth printed with cartoon stars, a box of birthday candles in the shape of the number 8, and a handwritten checklist on a piece of notebook paper. Daniel picked up the checklist, scanned it, set it down. He'd written it Thursday night after Lily had gone to sleep, sitting at this same table with a glass of water and the particular quiet that belonged to the hours after 10 p.m. He'd been oddly nervous writing it, like the list itself made things real. 8 years. He let that sit in his chest for a second. 8 years since she was born in the hospital room on a Tuesday morning in October. Since she'd opened her eyes and looked up at him, really looked, even if it was just reflex, even if she couldn't actually see him, and he'd understood for the first time that he was someone's whole world. 8 years of school pickups and skinned knees, of grocery store arguments about cereal brands, of bedtime stories, read so many times the spines of the books had cracked. 8 years since Sandra had walked out of this same house with a rolling suitcase and the calm, apologetic explanation that she hadn't been ready and still wasn't, that this wasn't the life she'd imagined. That she was sorry. She was genuinely sorry. He was past the anger now. He'd been past it for a long time. What remained was something quieter and harder to name, not resentment exactly. More like a permanent awareness of a weight he carried, a readjustment to how he held himself in the world. The balloons took 40 minutes. His hands were getting tired by the end, and the silver ones kept coming out asymmetrical, too wide at the bottom. He tied them to chair backs and doorknobs and the thin metal lattice of the porch railing, spacing them as evenly as he could. The yard was small, just a square of grass with a wooden fence on 3 sides and a concrete patio where he'd set up a folding table and 4 chairs. He'd borrowed 2 extra chairs from his neighbor, Mrs. Calloway, who was 72, and grew tomatoes, and always saved a few for Lily. The cake was the part he'd dreaded most. He'd watched 3 tutorials. He'd bought 2 boxes of mix, just in case, and a container of pre-made frosting, because the tutorials made scratch frosting look achievable, and he'd learned not to trust that. He'd baked the night before while Lily slept 2 round layers, 9-inch pans, 28 minutes at 350. They'd come out fine, slightly domed on one side. That was okay. He'd read that was okay. The frosting was where it had gone wrong. He'd spread the first coat too thick. And when he tried to smooth it with the back of a spoon, the way the tutorial showed, the crumbs had dragged up and mixed into the white frosting and turned it grayish in patches. He'd put it in the fridge overnight and tried again this morning with the second coat, and the result was functional. It was honestly fine. The pink rosettes around the edge had come out reasonably close to what he'd intended. The surface was a little uneven, the transition between layers visible under the frosting. But it was a real cake. It looked like a birthday cake. The writing was what he'd spent the most time on. He'd bought a set of decorating pens, the kind with small tips for piping, and he'd practiced on a sheet of paper first. Happy birthday, Lily. He'd written it 11 times before he felt steady enough to try the actual cake. His handwriting had never been good. He wrote in a forward-leaning print that always looked slightly rushed. The name came out all right. The H in happy had a wobble to it. He stared at it for a long moment, considered whether to try to fix it, decided not to. The fixable things you made worse by overcorrecting. He'd learned that, too. He stepped back and looked at the whole table. The cake in the center, the plates and napkins fanned out to the side. the little cups of fruit salad he'd made the night before, the pitcher of lemonade in the fridge. The balloons moved gently in the early morning air coming through the screen door. The tablecloth with the stars on it caught the light. It wasn't perfect, but it was something he'd made with his hands, with his time, with the hours scraped together from the edges of a week that hadn't had many edges to spare. He'd worked a Saturday shift at the shop, specifically to cover the cost of the decorations and the food. He'd told his manager he needed the hours. He heard the sound of small feet on the floor above him, and then the particular creak of the third stair, the one he kept meaning to fix, and then Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway. She was wearing her pajamas with the frogs on them, hair loose and sleep-tangled, eyes still half closed. She looked at the table and then at him, and her face went through several distinct phases before settling on something that wasn't quite a smile but was more than one. "You stayed up late," she said. "Went to bed at 11. That's late. I know." He held out his arms, and she crossed the kitchen and let him fold her in, her head at his chest. He could feel her looking at the table over his arm. "It looks really nice, Daddy. You haven't seen the cake yet." She pulled back and looked at it properly. He watched her study the wobble in the H, the uneven frosting at the sides, the rosettes that were slightly different sizes. He watched her look at the whole thing. The way children look at things when they're deciding whether to love them. "It has my name on it," she said. "It does. Did you write it?" 11 practice runs. She looked up at him. "How many times did you get it right on paper?" 11. She thought about that. Then she smiled. Really smiled. The one that showed the gap where she'd lost her front tooth in February. "I think it's the best cake I've ever seen." He knew she was saying it because she loved him. He also knew she meant it completely, and that both of those things were true at the same time. And that this was one of the ways children were wiser than adults, without knowing it. The party was scheduled to start at 2. By 1:50, 3 of Lily's classmates had arrived with their parents. Sophie Mitchell dropped off by her father, a quiet man named Harold, who shook Daniel's hand twice and smiled apologetically at the modest setup before catching himself and redirecting his attention to the snack table. Marcus Webb arrived with his grandmother, a sturdy woman named Evelyn, in a floral blouse, who immediately asked if she could help, and spent the next 15 minutes rearranging the fruit cups in a way that was, admittedly, more attractive. Then came Priya Nadar, Lily's closest friend, who ran straight past all the adults to hug Lily and said, with complete sincerity, "I love your balloons." Daniel moved between the patio and the kitchen, refilling lemonade, answering questions from the kids about whether there was going to be a piñata. No. He was sorry. Next year, opening the back gate twice for late arrivals. By 2:15, the yard held 9 children and 5 adults. And the noise level had risen to the comfortable chaos of birthday parties everywhere, running feet, arguments about who got the pink plate, Lily's laughter floating above all of it, like something fixed in place. He had spent some time worrying, in the weeks leading up to this, about whether the party would be enough. Not enough in the absolute sense he knew Lily would be happy regardless, but enough in the comparative sense, the social sense, the sense in which children absorbed information about their place in the world from the evidence of how it treated them. He'd been to 2 other birthday parties this year, for classmates of Lily's, and both of them had been held in dedicated party venues with professional entertainers, and printed invitations and goodie bags containing things that individually cost more than his electricity bill. He'd watched Lily at those parties, watched her move through the spaces with perfect ease, neither covetous nor diminished, and he'd thought, she's all right. She was all right. She had a quality of contentment that he couldn't take credit for. It was hers, native and persistent, carried in her since before she was old enough to have learned it from anywhere. He was refilling the lemonade pitcher when Evelyn touched his arm. "She's a wonderful little girl," the woman said. And she meant it not the polite, automatic meaning of party small talk, but the real kind, the kind that had observation in it. "She is," Daniel agreed. "She really is. You've done something right," Evelyn said. "I know it doesn't always feel like it, raising them alone. But look at her." They both looked. Lily was in the far corner of the yard attempting to teach Marcus, who was 9 and notably uncoordinated, how to do a cartwheel. She was patient about it, in a way that went beyond 8-year-old patience, holding his hand through the motion 3 times before letting go. Marcus fell sideways twice and laughed both times. "Yeah," Daniel said softly. "I look at her a lot." He was still smiling when the car turned into the street. It wasn't the car itself that changed things first, it was the sound of it. A new model SUV had a particular quiet at idle, a hum more felt than heard. And this one had pulled to the curb with the smooth certainty of machinery that had never needed to be fixed. Daniel noticed it from the corner of his eye. The rear passenger door opened before the car fully stopped. Chloe Bennett stepped out. She was 16, tall in a way that looked practiced rather than natural, with long dark hair and the kind of posture that came from a childhood of piano lessons and being told to stand straight. She was wearing a white wrap dress that probably cost more than Daniel's weekly paycheck, and she surveyed the yard, his yard, the balloons, the folding tables, the kids in their party hats with a slight, unhurried tilt of her head. She was a classmate's older sister. That was how she'd been invited. Technically, Emma Garrison, age 8, who'd handed Lily a hand-decorated envelope 3 weeks ago, with the careful formality of a child who took social rituals seriously, had mentioned her sister might come along. Lily had said, "Oh, okay, great." And Daniel had not thought further about it. He recognized Chloe now. Not personally, he'd seen her in the school parking lot twice, always being dropped off by a driver, always moving through the space like she was slightly above the level of it. Her mother was Victoria Bennett, whose name appeared in the business section of the local paper with some regularity. Real estate, tech investment, something in logistics. Daniel didn't follow it closely. He knew the name the way you knew certain names in a city, without knowing the person. He went back inside to get napkins. When he came back out, Chloe had moved to the edge of the patio and was standing with her arms folded, looking at the cake. The adults had grouped themselves near the fence, the polite clustering of people who had the party as their only point of commonality. Someone had made a comment about the weather. And then there had been general agreement about the weather. And now the conversation had nowhere natural to go. Daniel was passing out plates when he heard Chloe's voice, not loud exactly, but pitched at a register that carried. "Is this the whole party?" Emma, her sister, glanced up quickly. A few of the other children stilled. Lily was standing near the cake table. She looked at Chloe, and then at her father, and in that fractional pause, 8 years of having learned to read her father's face showed in her expression. A brief evaluation of whether there was something to worry about. "Do you want some cake?" Lily said. The brightness in her voice was entirely real. She hadn't heard anything to be offended by yet. Or she had, and was choosing not to be. Either one would have been like her. Chloe looked at the cake. "Not the way you look at food, but the way you look at a problem." "Did someone make that?" she asked. "My dad did," Lily said. Chloe's expression shifted in a way that was very small and very specific, a flicker of something that was almost discomfort at the simplicity of the answer, turning quickly into something that lived closer to contempt. "Right," she said. Daniel had come to stand near Lily. He put his hand briefly on her shoulder, just touch. Just the weight of his hand. "There's lemonade and fruit, if you want," he said to Chloe. He kept his voice level. She looked at him. There was a moment where Daniel thought maybe that was all it was going to be, a look, a coolness, nothing more. He'd encountered coolness before. You learn to let it go, but Chloe was 16. And the thing about being 16 and having grown up in rooms where people moved quickly to accommodate you was that silence felt like an invitation. It started quietly enough. "My dog had a birthday party last month," Chloe said, looking around the yard. "We used the whole back property, catered. Professional decorator." She paused. "Cost about $22,000. Nobody said anything. "For a dog?" Marcus's grandmother said, very quietly. It wasn't quite a question. Chloe turned. "It's about creating an experience," she said, with the patience of someone explaining something obvious. "Even for a pet, The yard had developed a particular quality of silence, not the absence of noise. The children were still shuffling and whispering, but a hush among the adults, a pulling inward. Daniel kept his expression still. He'd learned to do this over years of difficult customers, of managing his own anger in spaces where expressing it wouldn't help. He was thinking about Lily's face. Chloe's gaze moved back to the table, to the cake. "Honestly," she said, almost to herself, and then louder, "my dog's birthday cost more than this whole party." "Chloe," Emma's voice, sharp and small. Chloe glanced at her sister. "I'm just saying. You don't have to say it. It's true, isn't it? Mom spent 22. Stop. Emma was 8 years old, and she knew something was wrong, even if she couldn't name the shape of it. Chloe was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Daniel with an expression that he'd encountered before, on a different face, in a different context, the look of someone who has been mildly inconvenienced by another person's feelings. "I mean," she said, "you couldn't even get a real baker? For your daughter's birthday?" The word daughter landed badly. It was the wrong word to have used. Daniel said, "Please, this is her special day." 3 words in a sentence. He said them without heat, without elevation, just stated them. The way you state a fact. Lily had stopped moving. She was standing 2 feet to Daniel's left, holding a paper plate, and she was looking at the grass. Her shoulders had come up slightly, the way they did when she was trying to be smaller without knowing she was doing it. Daniel had seen that posture before. He knew what it meant. Her hand was gripping the edge of her plate. "I didn't mean," Chloe started, and then stopped. She didn't finish the sentence, which might have been because she hadn't worked out what she meant to say, or might have been because she knew the end of it wouldn't help her. "I'm sure you didn't," Daniel said. And that was the whole truth of it. He was sure she hadn't meant it the way it had landed. She was 16, and had grown up never having to consider how things landed on people who hadn't grown up the same way she had. She wasn't malicious. She was just inexperienced in the particular way that wealth, when it arrived early enough and stayed long enough, sometimes made people inexperienced. But Lily was 8, and her shoulders were up, and the paper plate was crumpled at the edge from the grip of her hand. Someone should have spoken. One of the other parents, maybe. Or Marcus's grandmother, who had looked at Chloe with an expression that suggested she had opinions. But there is a particular social machinery that activates in the presence of wealth, a hesitation, a recalibration, a brief suspension of the normal rules, and it had activated here, and so the yard was quiet. Daniel crouched down next to Lily. He didn't do it dramatically. He just lowered himself to her level, put his hand gently on the back of her head, and said, quietly, "Hey." She looked at him. "You want to know a secret about the cake?" he said. She waited. "I practiced the H 11 times. And it still came out a little wobbly." She looked at him for a moment. Then the corner of her mouth moved. "I know," she said, "and the rosettes on the right side are bigger than the ones on the left. I noticed that, and the frosting has crumbs in it in 2 places." She was nearly smiling now, reluctant and real at the same time. "And," he said, "it's the best cake I've ever made." "It's the only cake you've ever made," she pointed out. "First one. Best one. Both things are true." She did smile then, not the gap-toothed full one, but something smaller and more private, the one that was just for him. He stood up, and he didn't look at Chloe, because he wasn't thinking about Chloe. For a few minutes after that, the party attempted to reconstitute itself. Marcus's grandmother began talking about something resolutely unrelated to what had happened, a recipe for lemon squares, whether cinnamon was the right addition, and 2 of the other parents leaned into the conversation with the relief of people finding solid ground. The children had mostly moved on. Priya had taken Lily's hand, and they were standing near the fence examining something in the grass, and their heads were bent together in the absorbed conspiracy of 8-year-olds. Chloe stood a few feet apart from everyone, scrolling through nothing on her phone with the performance of someone who was trying to look like they weren't affected. She was 16. She wasn't as invisible as she thought she was. A man named Thomas Howard, who was there as Priya's father's +1 Priya's father, James Nadar, had brought him along as a colleague had been standing quietly at the edge of the patio throughout all of this. Daniel knew him only slightly, the way you knew neighbors of neighbors. Thomas was 50 or so, gray at the temples, wearing a collared shirt buttoned to the top on a warm afternoon. He'd said very little since arriving. He was watching Daniel now with an expression that Daniel couldn't read. Daniel's phone buzzed. He pulled it out, looked at the screen, glanced at Thomas. Something passed between them, not quite a look of recognition, more a confirmation. Thomas gave the smallest possible nod, which meant nothing to anyone watching, and meant quite a lot to Daniel. Daniel stepped toward the kitchen door. "Be right back," he said generally, to no one in particular, and went inside. He stood at the kitchen counter, with the phone to his ear. "Yeah," he said. "Another 20 minutes is fine. Just come around to the front when you get here." He paused, listening. "No, it's yeah. Come as you are." He hung up, stood there for a second, looking at the kitchen. The original frosting container was still on the counter. He threw it away. He washed his hands. He looked at the fruit salad cups lined up in the refrigerator, counted them, decided they'd be fine. Then he went back outside. The party continued. Lily played a card game with Priya and Marcus and won twice. Then lost once, in a way that made Marcus feel good, which was the kind of social intelligence that Daniel had never explicitly taught her. Thomas Howard watched all of this from the fence and said very little. And his expression, if you were watching carefully, was that of a man waiting. It arrived at 3:47. The sound was the same, that particular quiet hum, the smooth deceleration of something expensive, but this vehicle was black, where Chloe's had been silver, and it was followed by a second car, which was more unusual. The second car parked behind the first, and both sat at the curb for a moment before the doors opened. The driver of the first car stepped out and opened the rear door. A man in a dark blazer got out. He was in his late 50s, with gray hair cut close, the kind of even tan that suggested travel rather than leisure, and posture that was either the result of military background or simply the accumulation of years being the tallest person in rooms. He looked at the house number, looked at Thomas Howard, who had moved to the front fence, and gave a brief nod. Two people from the second car were already moving toward the gate, an assistant young, carrying a portfolio, and a man in a different blazer who was larger and quieter, and whose role was legible without being stated. The yard had noticed. It happened in stages. First, the children closest to the fence, drawn by the novelty of important-looking cars. Then the parents, turning from their conversations. Then, finally, Chloe, whose head came up from her phone with the trained alertness of someone who had grown up in houses where certain kinds of cars meant certain kinds of people. The man in the dark blazer opened the front gate and walked up the path. His attention moved through the yard in a swift professional sweep before settling on Daniel, who was standing near the cake table, and his whole manner shifted in the small but specific way of a person who has found what they were looking for. He extended his hand. "Mr. Carter," he said. "Richard Hayes. I've been trying to reach you for 3 weeks." The yard was very quiet. Priya and Lily had stopped their card game. Marcus's grandmother had set down her cup of lemonade. The assistant had moved to the edge of the patio and opened the portfolio, and inside it, visible in brief fragments before it was closed again, were documents with the dense, formatted look of legal paperwork. Daniel shook the hand. "I know," he said. "I know you have. I understand you wanted space." Richard Hayes kept his voice at a register that was meant to be private but carried. He hadn't learned how not to carry. Years of conference rooms and board tables, having built a projection he couldn't fully switch off. I respected that. But this has moved beyond the point where I can. "I know," Daniel said again. He said it without apology and without particular warmth. He said it the way a man speaks to another man he knows well enough to be direct with. Richard looked at him for a moment. Then something in his face softened, just slightly. "Just enough." "How long has it been?" he said. "Almost 4 years," Daniel said. 4 years. Richard shook his head. "You look the same. I look older. We all look older." Thomas Howard had crossed the yard and was standing nearby. He and Richard acknowledged each other with the ease of people who'd been in the same rooms for years. The other adults in the yard were doing the math. You could see it happening. The cars, the security, the way Richard Hayes had addressed Daniel not with deference, but with the specific respect of an equal, possibly a superior, in a context where that respect was unexpected. Emma, who was 8, said to no one in particular, "Who is that?" Priya, who was also 8, said, "I think that's a really important person." Lily was watching her father. "Is everything okay?" she said. Daniel looked at her. Whatever was happening with Richard Hayes, with the documents, with the machinery of a world that had been waiting 3 weeks for him to answer his phone, all of it was secondary, and he let that be visible in his face. "Yeah, sweetheart," he said. "Everything's fine. Mr. Hayes is an old colleague." "A colleague," Richard said, with a slight lift of an eyebrow that suggested he found the word a considerable understatement. "A former colleague," Daniel amended, with the edge of a smile. James Nadar, who had been standing near the fence and who was, in his professional life, a financial analyst who read quarterly reports the way other people read novels, was the first adult to say it out loud. "Richard Hayes," he said quietly to Thomas, as in Hayes Meridian. Thomas said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Hayes Meridian was the kind of company name that appeared in financial news as shorthand for scale, enterprise software infrastructure, something obscure and foundational, the kind of technology that other businesses depended on without being able to easily describe. It had been founded 11 years ago by 2 partners, one of whom was publicly known and publicly present, the other of whom had, at a certain point, faded from the official record. That absence had been explained various ways at various times. He wanted to pursue other ventures. He wanted to step back from operations. James Nadar looked at Daniel Carter standing in his backyard, with his balloon decorations and his slightly uneven birthday cake. And he understood something that the official record had never needed to say. He'd wanted to disappear. Richard Hayes had accepted a glass of lemonade from Marcus's grandmother, which was the kind of thing that only happened when someone was genuinely at ease or very good at performing ease, and he was addressing Daniel with a directness that suggested they were in the middle of a conversation that had been going on for 3 weeks across unanswered calls. "The board has approved everything," he said. "The terms you set out in February are—" "Today's not the day for this," Daniel said. Richard stopped. "It's my daughter's birthday," Daniel said. "Whatever needs to be signed or decided Monday, I'll come in. We'll do it properly." Richard looked at him, the assessing look of a person recalibrating. "Monday," he said. "Monday," Daniel confirmed. There was a pause. Then, Richard Hayes, who ran a company with 11,000 employees and a market valuation that appeared in financial articles with 7 digits before the decimal point, said, "All right." He looked at Lily, who was watching all of this with the careful attention of a child who knew something important was happening, but hadn't decided yet whether it was good or bad. "Happy birthday," he said to her. "Thank you," she said. "Do you want some cake?" The corner of Richard's mouth moved. "I'd love some," he said. Chloe had not moved. She was standing at the edge of the patio, one hand at her side, the other holding her phone loosely in a grip that had gone slightly slack. The screen had gone dark. She was watching Richard Hayes accept a plate of birthday cake from an 8-year-old girl in a party hat, and her expression had undergone a change that was visible even from across the yard, a slow, specific dismantling, the look of someone whose internal architecture is being rearranged against their will. She knew who Richard Hayes was. Of course she knew. You didn't grow up in the Bennett household without knowing Hayes Meridian. Her mother's company, Bennett Capital, held a significant position in a fund that was itself built around a cluster of tech infrastructure companies, and Hayes Meridian was the largest of them, and it was built on technology that her mother's legal team had spent 2 years working to properly understand, and the name of its less public founder, Chloe's phone buzzed. She looked at the screen, her mother's name. She didn't answer immediately. She stared at it through 2 full rings. Standing there in the yard in her white wrap dress, and the thing happening on her face was not fear exactly. She was 16. and she didn't fully understand the scale of what was happening, but it was the beginning of understanding. The edge of it. She answered, "Mom." Her voice was flat. She listened. "I'm at." She glanced around the yard. "I'm at the Garrison kids' friend's birthday party." "Mom, I." She listened again. Longer. Her free hand came up, and she pressed it flat against the side of her face. A gesture that belonged to a younger version of herself. "I didn't know." She listened. "Mom, I was just..." She stopped talking. She was listening for a while, and the people near her who couldn't hear the words could hear the register quick, clipped. The precise tone of a parent who is controlling their reaction. When the call ended, Chloe stood motionless for a few seconds. Then she looked up, and her gaze found Daniel, who was standing 15 feet away, talking to Richard Hayes and James Nadar in a low, easy way. One hand in his pocket, his whole manner unchanged, the same as it had been before the SUV, the same as it had been while she was making her comments about the cake and the catering. She crossed the yard. She stopped in front of him. He turned. "Mr. Carter," she said. Her voice had a careful, constructed quality, like someone speaking a language they'd studied rather than grown up with. "I want to apologize." Daniel looked at her. Not with anger. Not with the satisfaction of a person whose turn it was to deliver something. He looked at her the way you look at someone who is trying to say something true. She started, and stopped. "I was rude. And I said things that weren't okay. About your party. And about..." She stopped again. "I'm sorry." "I accept that," he said. She blinked. It was apparently not the response she'd been prepared for. She'd been ready, maybe, for a lecture, or a cold dismissal, or a pointed reference to what she now knew. None of those came. "It's not about the money," Daniel said. "It's not about who I used to be, or what my name is attached to." What you said hurt a child who was happy. He glanced in the direction of Lily, who was across the yard, crouched down with Priya, examining an anthill. "That's the part you should think about." Chloe looked at Lily. Lily hadn't noticed the conversation. "She's not angry at you," Daniel said. "She doesn't know how to stay angry at people. It's one of the things I'm trying to make sure I don't accidentally train out of her." He paused, but she noticed. Kids always notice. Chloe said nothing. She was still watching Lily, who had found a stick and was pointing at something in the grass while Priya leaned in to look. "Next time you're somewhere like this," Daniel said, "look at what's actually there before you decide what it's worth." He turned back to his conversation with Richard. Chloe stood there for a moment longer, and then she walked back to the edge of the patio, and she sat down in one of the folding chairs. And she was quiet for the rest of the afternoon. At 4:30, Daniel brought out the cake. He carried it from the kitchen with the careful two-handed grip of a man who dropped things before and learned from it. He set it on the table, and someone Marcus's grandmother had lit the candles while he was inside, so the cake arrived already glowing, the 8 little flames tilting slightly in the afternoon breeze, and the party gathered. The children pressed forward. The adults formed a loose ring behind them. Richard Hayes was still there, standing with James and Thomas, holding his plate. His assistant had put the portfolio away. They sang. It was the usual birthday song, imperfect in the way that unplanned harmonies always are. The adults a half beat behind the children on the first line. Everyone louder at the U at the end. Lily standing there in the middle of all of it with her eyes bright and her hands pressed together, and the look on her face that was somewhere between embarrassed and exactly as happy as she'd wanted to be. She closed her eyes. She blew. All 8 flames went out in one breath. The children cheered. Daniel clapped his hands once, a sharp and genuine sound, and Lily looked up at him with the gap-toothed smile, the real one, the full one, and for a moment nothing else in the yard existed. He cut the cake himself. Careful slices laid on plates, the frosting a little thick at the edges, the layers visible inside. He handed the first piece to Lily. He handed pieces to the children, in order of age, youngest first, and then to the adults, and Richard Hayes, who had at some point in his career eaten in rooms where the catering had been managed by people with Michelin stars, accepted his piece, and ate it without ceremony, and said it was good, which it was. It was a vanilla cake, with vanilla frosting and pink rosettes on the edge. It had taken 3 tutorials, and a night of practice, and a careful, wobbling H. It was exactly what it was, nothing more, nothing decorated beyond what he had, nothing supplemented by what he could afford. Chloe ate hers quietly, sitting in the folding chair. She looked at the cake when she ate it. She looked at Lily. She didn't say anything. But something had shifted in the quality of her silence. It was less performative now, less the silence of someone waiting to speak, and more the silence of someone genuinely attending. At 5, the party began to break up in the natural way of Saturday afternoon parties, parents gathering coats, children making final trades of game cards, the particular stall of children who knew the end was coming, and were trying to forestall it by inventing one more thing they needed to do. Priya hugged Lily for a long time. "Best birthday," she said. "Best birthday," Lily agreed. Thomas Howard shook Daniel's hand at the gate and said simply, "I'll see you soon." James Nadar said much the same thing, with a look that had more information in it. Richard Hayes shook Daniel's hand, then added a brief grip on the shoulder. "Monday," Daniel said. "Monday," Richard confirmed. The SUV left, then the second car. The yard slowly emptied. Marcus's grandmother helped fold the tablecloth and stack the plates, and Daniel told her she didn't have to. And she told him she knew, and kept going. And this is the way things are actually done between people who mean well. At the end, only Emma Garrison was left, waiting for her mother to pick her up. Sitting on the porch step, with her little present bag in her lap. Chloe was sitting next to her. They were quiet together in the way of sisters who had just been through something, and hadn't yet decided how to talk about it. Chloe looked up once at Daniel, who was inside through the screen door, washing dishes at the kitchen sink. And she looked at Lily, who was in the yard collecting stray balloon strings, her party hat now worn sideways, humming something to herself in the easy way of a child who has had a good day. Emma said to Chloe, without preamble, "Are you going to be different now?" Chloe was quiet for a moment. "I don't know," she said. "You should be," Emma said matter-of-factly. "I know," Chloe said. Later, after everyone had left, and Lily had been bathed and read to and fallen asleep, halfway through the second chapter of the book, they were working through together a story about a girl who trained horses in rural Montana, which Lily had chosen because she thought horses seemed like they would be good listeners. Daniel came back downstairs and sat at the kitchen table. The yard was quiet. The balloons were still there, some of them, the ones that hadn't drifted loose or been wrestled away by children. They moved gently in the evening air through the screen door. The table had been wiped down. Half the cake was in a covered container in the fridge, which would be breakfast tomorrow morning whether or not it was recommended, because it was her birthday cake and therefore exempt from normal rules. Daniel's phone was on the table. He looked at it for a moment, then picked it up. He had 11 voicemails from a number he'd been letting go to message for 3 weeks, and he didn't listen to them now either. Monday was Monday. He poured himself a glass of water and sat with it. What he thought about was not Richard Hayes, not the documents in the portfolio, not the number that would eventually be attached to his name when the thing he'd built came back into public view. He had built something real, and it had grown the way real things grow slowly, structurally, without needing him to be attached to it every moment. He was proud of it the way you could be proud of something you'd already let go of. What he thought about was the wobble in the H. He'd been going to redo it. The first time he'd stood back and looked at it, wobble and all, he'd reached for the decorating pen automatically, prepared to smooth it out, to make it better. And then he'd stopped, because something in him had recognized that the wobble was part of it, not a flaw to be corrected, but evidence of the hand that had made it. The 11 attempts, the care that looked clumsy from the outside, and was anything but from the inside. He left it. That had been the right decision. He thought about Lily's face when she'd said, "I think it's the best cake I've ever seen." And the layered truth of it. She loved him. She meant it. Those things were not in conflict. He thought about Chloe sitting at the edge of the party, watching. He thought about the look on her face when she'd understood. And then the look when she'd understood that what she'd understood wasn't the point he was going to make to her. There was something in that, something he hoped she'd carry for a while, the way you carry lessons that arrive unexpectedly in the middle of Saturday afternoons. He thought about what it meant to want a normal life for your child. The decision he'd made, 4 years ago, to sell his shares, to leave the company in Richard's more than capable hands, to come here to this ordinary house, in this ordinary neighborhood, and be the person who made birthday cakes and practiced the H11 times. That decision had been made for Lily. But it hadn't only been for Lily. It had been for himself as well. He had wanted to know what it felt like to make something imperfect with his hands and have it be enough. He had wanted to live in a world where the H on the birthday cake was the most important thing he'd done that day. He still did. The balloons moved in the evening air. The kitchen was quiet. Upstairs, his daughter was asleep with her frog's pajamas and her loose hair and her gap-toothed smile and her particular gift for knowing without being told what was actually worth being happy about. Tomorrow was Sunday, and he'd promised her the park in the morning and the farmer's market in the afternoon and nothing else in between. Monday was Monday, and it would bring its own weight, its own complications, the deliberate re-emergence of a part of himself he'd set aside. That was fine. He was ready for it. He'd needed the 4 years. He drank his water. He turned off the kitchen light. He went upstairs. He kept his word. Monday came with gray cloud cover and the smell of cut grass from someone's lawn service 2 streets over. And Daniel drove to the Hayes Meridian offices in the same sedan he'd owned for 3 years, parked in the visitor lot, and rode the elevator to the 14th floor in a collared shirt he'd ironed the night before. Richard's assistant, a young man named Stephen Frost, who had the organized efficiency of someone raised to believe that being 10 minutes early was the same as being on time, met him at the elevator and walked him through a reception area that Daniel recognized, distantly, from the early days when the furniture had all been folding tables, and the reception area had been a hallway with a printed sign taped to the wall. It had grown. Everything had grown. He spent 3 hours in a conference room with Richard and 2 lawyers whose names he immediately forgot, and he signed things, and there were conversations about timelines and structures and the particular vocabulary of institutional finance that he'd once spoken fluently, and now moved through with the slight effort of someone returning to a language after a long absence. He answered questions honestly. He asked 2 of his own. At 11:15, Richard stood and shook his hand and said, "It's good to have you back in the building." "I'm not back," Daniel said. "I'm just finishing something I started." Richard looked at him for a long moment. Then he smiled, "The real one, not the conference room one." "Fair enough," he said. Stephen Frost offered him coffee on his way out, and Daniel accepted a cup and stood at the window of the reception area for a few minutes, looking out at the city. The cloud cover had thinned while he'd been inside, and the light coming through was that particular quality of mid-morning light that belonged specifically to weekdays, purposeful, slightly demanding, carrying the weight of things that needed to happen by noon. He thought about Lily, who was at school right now, probably at recess, probably performing cartwheels or attempting to improve Marcus's technique. He thought about the cartwheel lesson with the patient steadiness of a child who believed that most things were teachable if you just showed them slowly enough. He thought about the way she'd looked at the cake. He finished his coffee, set the cup down, and took the elevator back to the lobby. 3 weeks later, a card arrived at the house. Handwritten, cream-colored envelope. No return address. Printed just a name in the corner. C. Bennett. Inside, on a single card, in handwriting that was neat but had the slightly effortful look of something practiced rather than natural. "Mr. Carter, I've been thinking about what you said, about looking at what's actually there. I wanted you to know I heard it. I'm sorry for what I said at the party, not because of who you are, because of what I said. Chloe." Daniel read it twice. Then he set it on the kitchen counter, where it stayed for a week, before he put it in the drawer with the things he didn't want to throw away. He never responded directly, but 2 months later, when Emma Garrison invited Lily to her birthday party held at a proper venue, with a professional cake and printed invitations, Chloe was there, helping with the decorations, taping streamers to the wall with the focused application of someone who was choosing to be useful. She looked up once when Daniel dropped Lily off, and she said, "Hi, Mr. Carter," and he said, "Hi, Chloe," and that was the whole of it. It was enough. Some things didn't need to be resolved so much as simply continued past. You carried the better version of yourself forward, and you let the worse version recede. And eventually, the distance between them was large enough that the worse one became theoretical. You hoped for that, for other people. Sometimes you saw it happen. Lily ran into the venue without looking back, already calling for Emma, and Daniel stood at the curb for a moment before getting back in the car. He was due at the shop by 9. He had 3 repairs scheduled before noon: a compressor, a dishwasher motor, and something someone had described over the phone as making a sound like it's arguing with itself, which was his favorite kind of problem to diagnose. The kind where you had to listen carefully before you assumed you knew what was wrong. The kind that punished rushing. He drove to work in the ordinary morning light, and the city went on around him in the way that cities did, indifferent and continuous, and he was exactly where he had chosen to be. The cake was in the refrigerator that first night, with its uneven rosettes and its wobbling H, and it was, without any qualification, the best birthday cake that had ever been made in that kitchen, not because of what it cost, not because of what it looked like, but because of the hand that had made it, and who that hand had made it for. Some things are worth exactly what they cost in effort and love, and not $1 more or less. The H was wobbly. It was exactly right.